we can adjust this. The other implement that we don't have a lot of in here is we can use pulleys. So you'll see if we went over to the third floor of the rec center, you'll see a lot of pulley activities, things like that where we can do that. Where we can use resistance that is a fixed bar, it's going to provide us with a fixed resistance. It doesn't accommodate, it doesn't change through range of motion. It's simply going to go straight up, straight down. I gave you all 6-pound bars. They're all going to be 6-pound resistance. So everything should be, equal. But when we think about, one of the things we can do with the bands is we can adjust the resistance point. So we can set that closer, so think about this. Now you work with a partner. Grab a partner, grab a band, and one of you is going to hold the center of the band and one of you is going to hold the handles, and you can make it harder or easier for them to do their bicep curls by how you hold that position away from them. The other position is we can adjust, we can adjust in this position. So if we're doing this, she's losing, we have to adjust the range of motion. So in this position, she's actually shortening the musculature. So we can change the loading point. Can we change the loading point with the bar? The resistance loading point, because what's its loading point? It's relative to gravity. The band is influenced alternate to gravity. So we can do horizontal activities, things that are going with no influence of gravity, versus we can do things where if we had a high point attachment, we can do something that's pulling down or pulling up. So the band has a lot more versatility, but its compromise is in the fact that as you go farther and farther through the range of motion, it's getting harder and harder. So it does have some drawbacks. So knowing what we get from the fitness implement, we can see a lot of changes into what we can do with the activity. So how do we use this for different individuals? What do we do with this? So if we're training an individual to do an activity, they're non-injured, so they come in, what's going to be our best approach? Because the limitation of this, think about if they're doing an explosive movement, so they're a baseball pitcher. Can we mimic a baseball pitching movement with a dumbbell?
It's hard.
We can. You can do this with a dumbbell.
You have to lay.
Can you mimic a baseball pitching movement with that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not a pitcher.
Yeah, well, but just a throwing motion. Just try to.
Yeah.
3 pounds. You can go one. You can get these as light as 1.5 pounds. So they're really, you can adjust the intensity. Obviously, that's going to be relative to what? The strength.
Weight.
But what else happens here?
Oh.
So think about this. What is our desired speed of movement for a baseball pitch? Explosive. So think about this. You have in your hand what we said, these are pretty adaptable, these bands. So now imagining that you have someone standing behind you with your band and you're trying to do, you can just go ahead. Now try to do that range of motion through the baseball pitch with the band. They're standing behind you.
You want to throw or yeah?
Oh, yeah.
That's all you got.
What's wrong with this?
What's wrong with it?
It's getting harder at the point where you want to build acceleration.
Right.
So is this an advantage to developing the speed of movement in a baseball pitch?
Maybe not.
It could increase the muscle.
But it's going to increase the muscle. Do we want
don't have the band, you'll be faster, more
to a point,
efficient.
yeah. But what are we training? If we're training this, specificity tells us what's happening. In just exactly how you're training right now. Go through it one more time, do it again. Make sure each person gets that feeling. So you want to start the band loaded when you're in your position where you start that movement. So the band comes on halfway through. So if you're the person holding the band, step farther away from your partner. By the time you get to the point where you want to release the ball, what's your movement speed?
Slow.
Is it slowing down?
No. Oh, with this.
So in that sense, this is where we get into, have any of you heard about assisted versus resisted sprint training? Where we would, do assisted, where you're actually attaching a bungee cord to a person doing a sprint. And they're pulling you with the bungee cord versus resisted where you're going to tie it on your back and you're going to go forward. Well, the resisted is going to develop the strength of the movement because as the farther we get away from the tether point of the band, the elasticity effect increases the resistance. But that's not going to do us much good if we're trying to increase the speed of movement. So depending upon, these bands are great for certain things, but they're really not beneficial for getting into a explosive movement opportunity. So now turn around and face your partner when you're throwing this, and they're going to back away from you even farther. So you're going to get into the position like you're going to throw the baseball, but they're facing you. So now in this position, now you throw it, and you feel how it starts to accelerate your arm into the movement. That's the assisted portion. So as you release that position and you start to throw through, it's actually going to mimic what you do in a baseball throw, where it's going to begin slower and build that momentum.
So in other words, you want to do sort of
You would want to do a combination of both.
Yeah.
So the problem is we think about resisted position we do an awful lot of, but we don't get into the problem where resisted is going to slow our speed of movement. Again, we go back to specificity. The speed of movement that we perform under a training condition is the speed of movement that we're going to have the strength to recruit in a competition position. So think about dumbbells. One of the aspects that's really detrimental with dumbbells is what? We never really get to the point of accelerating those to the point of release. Where that's our opportunity for.
unless you actually throw it.
Well, yeah, but for the most part, we're not going to do a lot of throwing of, dumbbells.
Yeah.
We would use medicine balls, and they're all, of course, packed away. I can't get to them. But we can use medicine balls for that activity. So that's where we would actually have a resisted implement that now we explosively recruit to allow us to mimic that same movement. So a lot of what we do in this fitness application is understanding the physics behind what we're doing. So the specificity tells us that, if our movement is ballistic in this fast-paced movement, we want to train it to be recruited in a fast-paced activity. But in order for us to do that, what do we have to do to build power? What is power? Speed at which we can produce a force over a range of motion. So it's basically our force times distance divided by time. So if we think about power, it's force times distance divided by time. Well, so power is a two-pronged component. So typically when we get into fitness resistance, we think about power activities. We want to think about, a lot of times you get into the exercise prescription element. They'll teach you that it's all about the force production. You have to up the force production. But upping the force production only works on one half of the equation. It doesn't work on the speed of movement part. So we have to do both. And that's where we get into the opportunities to do things like plyometric, like, medicine balls, explosive movement opportunities. So it's understanding how do we develop that through utilizing the different opportunities we have. So instead of just thinking about one type of training and getting stuck into the idea that it's all got to be bars and dumbbells and resistance plates, they have a limitation to their efficacy. They're only going to adapt so far. Resistance bands equally is the same. So in this position, we really don't get that position of releasing and exploding. So that's where having that multitude of opportunities really advances your opportunities to develop. Instead of thinking about, okay, I'm just a one-trick pony and I'm going to do all exercise resistance, it's all bars and plates, that only has a certain amount of, because if we think about it, we're training squats to train people to jump, right? We want to get the lower body stronger, but what happens as we go through the range of motion and we go higher and higher intensities? What happens to the speed of movement? So as you saw, getting closer to that maximal resistance as you saw with the bands, the more resistance I encountered, I see the speed of movement coming to a halt, because it's that inverse relationship between velocity and force. So the force velocity curve says that as I get more and more force, the rate at which I can develop that force goes down, because I don't have the same opportunity. Because when I go through the muscular recruitment, I have to have a certain number of those cross bridges attached at any point in time in order to secure that amount of force. Well, in order for movement to occur, I have to have those cross bridges release and that cycling effect transfer so that I can have the next phase move. So I'm basically going from point A to point B to point C. So if you're actually almost like doing that, playground, and you're walking, doing the overhead bars, you're kind of going from rung to rung to rung on that playground structure. That's basically how you would walk down the chain. But if you're in a position where you're not really stable, what happens to that little kid who can barely control his body weight hanging on the bar? This position opens the vulnerability. He doesn't have the force to control that. So in that position, he's just going to stay there and swing. So in that position, that's what's happening with the muscle. If you can't control enough of the force, you're not going to have the mobility. So they're at an opposing element for speed of movement and force production, because in order to provide the speed of movement, we have to have that walking down the actin chain with the myosin heads kind of cycling through that myosin chain, or actin chain. If they don't, it's basically a tug of war. We're just going to stay there and stay static. So that's what happens when we get into an isometric contraction, is it stays static. We have a lot of force applied, but no movement. Whereas as we go nearer and nearer maximal force production, speed of movement declines. So knowing what we know about that movement now helps us as we get into exercise design programs that are going to help us with this. We can think about how do we, go ahead and have a seat.
So in the speed, we're working the antagonist muscle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is that helping to retrain the Golgi tendon as well?
It does, to a point where Golgi tendon organ.
Because it seems like it would give it more stability for that movement, that fast movement.
Well, the Golgi tendon organ is going to determine the amount of force of the movement. What's going to allow the speed of movement is the spindle fibers, where they're telling us and focusing on the rate of that force development. So it's the combination of the proprioceptors between the Golgi tendon organs, the spindle fibers, that are going to tell us that.
So the reason that helps is because it's training the spindle fibers.
It's gonna train that, because if you think about this, we go to the doctor, we get our reflexes tested. What does he do? Takes out the rubber mallet, whacks you on the kneecap, or just below the kneecap. What happens?
You kick.
If he hits you abruptly enough, you're going to have a reflex where your lower limb should kick out. That's a stretch short. So as we stretch the quadriceps by hitting the patellar tendon, we have a very high rate of stretch going on that the muscle doesn't like. So it says, hey, I don't like that, so I'm going to reflex, and I'm going to control that by, I'm going to shorten that muscle immediately, because it feels like something's trying to tear that muscle apart. So its protective mechanism is to just immediately shorten, because in its shortened position, it has the most control over joint integrity, most control over muscular stability. If it's at an end range of motion, it's a little bit more vulnerable. It's kind of like, if you think about, standing on the flat level ground, we feel fairly stable. But if we stick you on, walking on a 4x4 plank across the floor, you feel okay. But now we raise that 4 feet in the air like in gymnastics, balance beam. All of a sudden, it's like our whole balance is, changed. So we get to a certain point where control factors we like to have, and those are where our reflexes align themselves. So when we're trying to train speed of movement, we have to have the range of motion mimic that speed of movement. So much the same way when we talk about flexibility, recognizing the appropriate range of motion, it's the speed of movement as well. So we would never want to engage in a movement where we don't gradually ramp up that speed of movement in some sort of preparatory fashion. We don't want to see a baseball pitcher go out there and throw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball first pitch out. We want him to go out there and do some warm-up, so he's going to go out there and gradually start to bring the speed of the pitches up so that he's letting the body say, okay, I'm comfortable with this. We don't see someone go out there and, sprint the 100-meter dash from a cold position. They've never had, any warm-up. They've never done any starts or anything like that. You'll see them typically go out there and they'll start to develop that slowly and steadily in an increasing fashion, because it's all about the proprioceptive control. If the body perceives from a proprioceptive standpoint that something is out of context or something is presented in a way that's going to cause a detrimental influence, it goes into a protective mechanism. So in the sense of the Golgi tendon organ, if the forces are high enough that we sense something's dangerous, it's going to hit the giant red stop button and send a relaxed message to the muscle, and all they're going to do is just kind of go, they turn off. There's no tension developed. So in that situation, the protective mechanism is just to go limp. It's like playing dead in front of a bear. Whereas in the situation where it's the other end, where it's like it feels like it's being torn apart because it's rapidly being stretched, the muscle says, hey, wait a second, this isn't right, I don't like this. I'm going to control this by trying to shorten the muscle immediately. Because in that position, it's a guarding reflex. It provides you with that position. So it's all about engaging the right proprioceptors for the right task and making sure that they're cued to the activity. So the same neurological specificity goes on with the same physiological and mechanical specificity. So we see the advantages and disadvantages of each type of muscle strength and endurance program. So we can see that the limitations of doing barbell, doing dumbbells, doing any kind of fixed resistance, not really going to be great for explosive activities because we don't have a release engagement. You're not going to stand there and throw dumbbells in the air. You're not going to stand there and see somebody doing, a shot-putting motion where we're trying to develop, strength in, the flexors of the chest, to do that forward pushing position, and then suddenly just going to, explode the barbell. You're going to do bench press and then just going to release the bar. Not going to happen. The only way you could do that is now we can do that by using a different type of program. We could do plyometric push-ups. So we could do explosive push-ups to get that same explosive movement, or we could do medicine balls. So we can change that whole element. So this is where being able to understand what each task presents and what opportunities it creates and what limitations it has involved. Develop graded exercise series for strengthening and justify the selection and order of exercises using the outline for kinesiology analysis. So as we look at developing a graded exercise series, what is this? This is taking into consideration the concepts that we call progression. Because as we use muscles over a span of time, what happens to those muscles?
They adapt.
They're going to adapt. As they adapt, we have to continue to adjust our program to that adaptation. If we keep it at status quo, we're going to become lower and lower and lower percentages of its intensity. As the muscle develops greater strength capacity, if we say, okay, we're going to come in and your job is to lift the 55-pound dumbbells for bench press. You're going to do dumbbell bench press 55 pounds. You're going to do that same weight for the next 10 weeks. As your muscles get stronger, the relative intensity of that activity goes down. So as your relative intensity of that activity goes down, your training stimulus starts to alter. Back up here where we were talking about, describing what we were trying to do and how do we want to accommodate that, knowing that difference between are we recruiting the muscle for strength or are we back down to that 40 to 60% where we're not even engaging all of the motor units. So progression allows us to keep that relative intensity at a somewhat similar level of overload. So we're just constantly adjusting the threshold level for that overload stimulus to be slightly ahead of our body's adaptation. So if we allow the body's adaptation to catch up with it, then we're kind of falling behind the curve for developmental opportunity. But if we stay just one step ahead, it's always going to be kind of like that carrot in front of the mule. You want it to keep going, but you don't want the mule to catch the carrot, because once he does, he stops and eats, and you're not going anywhere the rest of the day. He shuts down. Same thing for development. We want to keep that progressional development going so that we have to keep trying to catch up to that movement from the body standpoint. So, developing flexibility. We talked about this. So, flexibility is the ability of tissue surrounding a joint to yield to stretching without interference or opposition. Part of this opposition comes from the recruitment of the opposing musculature too. So if you think about what happens in the engagement of those movements, we will feel that certain muscles are going to contract, opposing muscles are going to contract to prevent that range of motion. So this is what happens when we get injured. So you notice when you sprain an ankle, suddenly you limit the range of motion at the ankle joint when you sprain it. You limit that, so we limp, we abrupt that movement. Because of what we call co-contraction, we will recruit both agonist and antagonistic pairs, because at that point in time, that co-activation, that co-recruitment, is going to give us the greatest amount of stability, because we're limiting the movement of the joint, but providing the greatest amount of structural support, And so flexibility is teaching the body how to stretch and how to reduce this interference or opposition for the opposing muscles. If you think about what happens in movements, many of us get into an idea, first time we go through a movement, when was the last time any of you in here learned a brand new skill? Been a while? Time to stretch our boundaries, folks.
Taking yoga for the first time.
Okay, so we take yoga for the first time. The first time you get into one of those yoga poses, what do you find? You find that you're contracting everything around the joint. Everything's firing off. And then as you get more and more familiar with that yoga pose, suddenly things tend to kind of dissipate. So when you watch a child learning how to walk, they walk a little bit like Frankenstein. Everything's stiff, everything's guarded. Little kids tend to walk like little robots. Instead of watching them walk fluidly, as we walk fluidly, that's that, understanding of what is the appropriate time to turn on, turn off, turn on, that proprioceptive communication chain, a lot of that happens in flexibility. So, one of the things we have to do in developing flexibility is to overcome our own internal, objection or our own internal resistance to the movement. And a lot of times that is just, allowing that muscle to turn off at the right position. And sometimes it's, re-educating the proprioceptive chain to say, hey, you've gone far enough, or this is too much, And tissues, when stretched, include ligaments, fascia, other connective tissue like tendons, musculotendinous junction, as well as the antagonistic muscle, So when we think about this situation, we're stretching the antagonistic muscles, and that's usually where we get into that. So anytime you're trying to develop flexibility around a joint, make sure you're focusing on balanced pairs, opposing muscle groups, but also back to that dynamic stability. We want to think about strengthening both sides of the joint so that we're recalibrating that geometry of the joint. Because good flexibility really does help us prevent pain and injury, help us improve our athletic performance, because we start from a good position of posture in that movement. We have all the advantages that we discovered last week to benefit our performance. This is the big one. Flexibility is joint and activity specific. So if you're that person, you can do yoga all day long, but if your yoga is that slow, steady, controlled position, you're not going to be able to recruit that at a highly, rapid movement, So yoga has to be, addressed in the sense that sometimes you change the style of yoga. Maybe you go to more of the Ashtanga style where you're in a movement-oriented base versus holding one position for an extended period of time. It's that flow from movement to movement. Range of motion about a joint depends upon the structure of the joint and the pattern of movement. But it's also going to depend upon what other factors, what influences range of motion around the joint. So think about all the factors that influence movement about a joint.
How much muscle you have?
Okay, so it's going to be our muscle mass. You know, obviously, if you have larger muscle mass, you're going to have a little bit restriction to the range of motion. So you're going to have that internal resistance of the larger muscle mass. You know, if you've got big biceps, it's going to, you know, influence when the bicep, runs into the forearm. It's going to be harder to get to extreme ranges of flexibility. What else influences range of motion about a joint?
The joint itself, like the type of joint it is.
The type of joint is going to be the biggest one, but within the different types of joints, what else influences range of motion? Beyond just the strength of the agonist and antagonist pairs, think about how you stabilize that. When we talked about, you know, the ability to do movements, if we can't stabilize that, you know, if that isn't where we could create that rigid point of force. You know, when we talked about last week, pushing and pulling, if we didn't have that ability to plant that force and have that rigid position where we can push through or pull through, you know, we can't create that motion. Well, if we don't have that ability to stabilize that joint in that range of motion won't exist. You know, so if you get into a position where your stabilizing musculature is weak around a position, you're not going to have much in the way of range of motion in that position. Because even just moving the joint into that position creates enough of a disconnect in the body that it's like, hey, this is not going well. You know, you can even under your own body weight create positions where we're feeling like we're going to have instability in joint structures. We're going to have some compromise to function. And that usually shows that we shorten range of motion. You know, a general program should include exercises that stretch tissues crossing the lower back, hip stretch, shoulder, knee, and ankle. So anywhere we have two joint muscles, we want to think about stretching both joints of that two joint muscle. You know, and other exercises should be added as appropriate for the demands of the given activity. And what they're meaning here is this is where we start to add in the resistance training, the dynamic flexibility things that are going to really advance the opportunity to develop the full component of joint stability. Static stretching. You know, this is where we get up there, the whole 30-second stretch. You know, it's preferred for less tissue damage, you know, principally because you stop before you reach that threshold. Ballistic stretching. You know, this is where, you know, it's a bouncing into the range of motion. You know, it uses momentum to override the tissue stretch. It may trigger stretch reflex, you know, which at that point in time is going to increase the tension on the muscle, which is going to increase the reflex recruitment of the Golgi tendon organ. But ballistic is to help develop dynamic flexibility. But can we do ballistic exercises in a different way? Yes. So we don't take it to the ballistic used to be the methodology of calisthenics way back in the 50s and 60s when they were doing this for military training. So it was find the end range of motion and then just bounce at the end range of motion, thinking that that bouncing was going to help you, you know, create loosening of the elastic tissues and the plastic tissues within the muscle. Usually what happened is you had, you know, little tissue tears in the muscle and you ended up doing more micro trauma to the muscle than you did beneficial development. So it actually was proven to be less effective because at some point in time you're going to create enough of that micro trauma that you actually start to get scarring, and scar tissue is even less flexible than normal muscle tissue. But dynamic flexibility, what's the difference between ballistic and dynamic flexibility?
I think dynamic is more controlled.
Dynamic is a controlled movement throughout the range of motion, the entire range of motion, not just stopping at one point of the range of motion, and that's our entire movement. Static is just basically what we were doing before, where we would hold that end position of the range of motion, rather than, you know, in a position where you'd be doing that same movement, but now you could be doing that in a position where you would take one of these elastic bands and you'd move through the range of motion, gaining that, you know, movement throughout the entire range of motion in a dynamic approach. You know, base flexibility, you know, you start with slow, small range of motion stretches, increase to fast, large range of motion stretches, you know, in a ballistic fashion, you know, and this is the same philosophy that we can do with dynamic. We would start with slower, smaller range of motion because we're going to recruit less of a change to the proprioceptor's normal acceptable range rather than, going too far too fast. So the whole thing about, if you think about what is a great example of dynamic flexibility, something like Tai Chi, something fluid, something that's, continuous, it's moving throughout the range of motion, but it doesn't have to be the greatest pace of movement. It doesn't have to be explosive and involvement. Active stretching. The antagonists of a joint action are stretched by the concentric contraction of the contralateral muscles. So active stretching is where we would actually recruit the muscles on the opposite side to recenter that joint geometry. And this can be used in almost every single joint in our body. Actively assisting, we can assist that through, facilitated stretches if we have, someone like a therapist or somebody like that who's going to help us move through that range of motion and extend that. But we can also have them be resisted so that they're actually helping us increase that strength of movement through a controlled fashion. Passive stretching, this is where you're going to have a partner, so you always see those ones where someone's stretching your anterior musculature by doing the posterior stretch, grabbing your arms, trying to bring your elbows together. You can see people who are, doing neck stretching, neck strengthening exercises, a lot of examples of passive stretching, partnering with someone, so you can involve a lot of this passive stretching involved. PNF stretching, this is a combination of static and dynamic stretching where, we sustain the static stretch, we go to the end range of motion, we're triggering that stretch reflex, but we're making it so that we're overriding that tendon reflex to shut down and the reciprocal inhibition. So we want to make use of that, muscle to go to the point where it's like, okay, Golgi tendon organ says relax, and turn off the muscle contraction portion, and then we can go through a greater range of motion. So the typical steps include repeat contraction, slow reversal hold, rhythmic stabilization, hold, relax, contract, relax methods. All of those are great examples of how we can do PNF stretching and moving it through active range of motion, moving it through an active recruitment in order to extend and expand our, opportunity for that. We don't want to engage in so much that we get excessive flexibility or hypermobility. We don't want to go to the point of altering ligament integrity around a joint. Because we can alter ligament integrity without getting to the point of creating injury. We don't have to tear a ligament in order to change it. If we can stretch a ligament, the thought was when we went, on an ambassador exchange to China, we were introduced to the Chinese acrobatic, and this one woman was able to bend over backwards and stick her head between her shins. That she had created such a, altered state of flexibility. But then if you looked at her, you're thinking, okay, now that's got to come with some level of, compromise, that she's going to have some serious hip mobility, low back mobility issues when she's moving or running or jumping, that at some point in time is going to create a deficit to her performance. So care must be taken when doing stretching exercises to avoid, undue laxity in supporting soft tissue and structures. We like having control, but we don't want to have too much range of motion. And this is why we get into contraindicated stretching exercises. So we get into the standing toe touches, deep knee bends, hurdler stretch. It's creating too much stretch. So if we go into the hurdler stretch, the old-fashioned hurdler stretch, it's that hyperflexion of the knee, that real forced position where we're trying to stretch the tendons and ligaments of the knee joint to the point where they become less stable and less capable of controlling the normal range of motion. We'll also see that in the yoga plow exercise where you're creating too much range of motion at the neck. So exercises for muscle strength and endurance. And these are where we get into they're related. Strength will affect endurance. Endurance will affect strength. So they're kind of opposite ends if you think about them in a continuum fashion. So if we put, endurance activities over here, strength activities over here, if I train this, it means that I'm going to have a movement away from my endurance opportunity. So they're going to slide whichever way we tend to focus on the continuum. So you're really not going to find, the happy medium where you're doing high endurance and high strength at the same time. Really what you're doing is just accommodating to some position in the middle of the spectrum. You're not going to find a marathon runner who is adept at doing a 100-meter sprint. So if you think about, the activities of the heptathlon and decathlon and the Olympics, it's trying to find, that person who has the greatest range of capacity, but in the middle of the performance spectrum. Because nobody in the heptathlon is really going to be the greatest marathoner or the greatest sprinter. You may find that they have favorite activities they lead towards one or the other, but that's usually where it's going to be their downfall, because you're going to find somebody else that's going to be able to perform well in a lot of the activities, but not at the peak of one activity. So it's a compromise. So they're related, strength and endurance. The different adaptations occur with different training protocols. So our adaptations for endurance have different physiological developments, different biomechanical, neurological developments than do strength protocols. So the adaptations that occur are going to skew us towards whatever our training emphasis is. And that's, again, why we want to think about that specificity role as being our primary focus. So conditioning activities should be specific to the needs of the individual and the activity. So obviously we're not going to stick someone in an activity that's going to supersede their individual capacity just to meet the needs of the activity. We have to build them up slowly, but also to the point where we're not going to just train that individual with no connective regard or, reconnecting to the activity. So, we're not just going to train someone to be, a fitness model and forget to train them to being, that basketball player, that baseball player, that tennis player, or the swimmer that they are hoping to be. So these three guys right here, these ones that we talked about, overload, specificity, and resistance. And without a doubt, these are the three overarching, program goals. These are the ones that will affect and limit everything we do. If we engage a muscle, the muscle must be exercised beyond its normal limit in order to produce changes in strength and or endurance. Specificity, the training must be to the specific nature of the activity and the demands of that activity. Progressive resistance, the training must be increased in it as adaptations are acquired in order for the continual use of the overload. So progressive resistance is just adjusting the amount of overload so that we stay one step ahead of adaptation. Momentum. How do we use momentum in training? How can it be benefited and how can it be controlled in order to change that? So where would we want to use momentum as an aspect of training? So in a resistance training program, where would we want momentum to be a part of our training? Any guesses? How about Olympic lifts? Anything that we're doing in Olympic lifts is all developed on momentum. So we want to get the weight moving, and as the weight starts moving, it's easier to continue its motion rather than have to do that continual overcoming its inertia. But how does momentum become bad?
For like a squat or a bench, if you just like get it and go straight right.
Oh yeah, I mean you got those guys who are trying to basically break their ribs by using the elastic rebound of. I mean I've seen so many of those guys. I was at a conference 15 years ago where they were showing guy doing bench press and put a 3-inch foam pad. Was doing 700-pound bench press, dropped it down, shattered the foam pad, and was like, then he's like, but by the time he got down there, he had so much elastic rebound that he had just basically, the last 2 inches of the range of motion to lock out with the triceps, because the rest of it was all just elastic function. Where else can momentum, if you think about trying to do anything, momentum is bad if we're doing things like, we're trying to do a bent row. And we're in a position where we're trying to stabilize the torso to do that if we're doing that momentum and we end up having that position of the low back recruited to move. Things like if we're doing, back extension exercises and we suddenly start using that momentum to accelerate upward, even doing biceps, doing bicep curls like we were doing here. We were doing slow and controlled. If you started to increase that speed, you're going to find that suddenly you start using to cheat. We can also see momentum used by if you got the guy who's trying to do maximal bicep curls. So he's in there and he's got the weight there and he thrusts the hips in, uses the upper body to create the momentum on the bar. He's not using the exercises that's supposed to be done. He's not recruiting biceps. It's the combination of how can he use that influence of his upper body and lower body to get that bar of momentum moving. Resistance arm. We think about resistance arm. The longer the resistance arm, the more strenuous the motion. So how can we change the resistance arm? Easy one. Stand up, grab your bar that you've got. Place it on your shoulders. Okay, so if you put this on the base of your neck, right up at your occiput where the skull meets the spine, slightly above that, that's considered a high bar position. Mid-bar position is resting on the shoulders, right below C7. A low bar position will be bringing it down a little bit farther in that position. But now if we really want to think about changing the resistance arm, okay, do a squat here in this position with a mid-bar position right below your C7 prominence in your neck. So do that squat and tell me, it should be fairly easy. And this is 6 pounds, so this really shouldn't be too dramatic to your resistance. But now think about this. Take that 6-pound bar, push it straight up overhead, and push it. Did that just suddenly change the resistance of the movement?
Yeah.
We found ourselves, that alters it. So that resistance arm, just that little bit of change with that light weight suddenly changes what we do. Because you'll find that we want to change that. The other thing we want to think about is alignment and impact. So we want to think about knees must remain in relation to our feet. And this says knees must remain over the feet. Low impact is preferred. So what they're meaning is we don't want our at the bottom of our squat position, knees collapsed inward in that knock-knee position. But also to the point where a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, your knees can't pass your toe. Well, what they're trying to train you to do is less effective. Because if you think about a position where you walk forward, take 2 steps forward and stop and notice where your position of your knee is. Your knee should be over your foot. But now if you try to change that position in a sprint position, is your knee going to pass your toe? Yeah. Okay, do this. Turn around, put your foot on your chair, like you're climbing stairs. Where's your knee in relation to your toe? As you were to actually go up, to step up, the knee goes forward of the toe. So what the acceptable position is, that would give you about 2 inches forward of the toe is more an acceptable control position. Don't try it on that one where the chair rotates. That one I don't want to see you falling over. So alignment and impact. We want to think about that position. But also when you think about jumping and landing from that. If you think about jumping and landing, and we try to keep our knees behind our toes. As you're coming from a maximal jump landing position and you're trying to do that, where's that stress going to go? It's going to go in the shins and right to the low back. Because if you try to stop that position, the lever arm's moving posteriorly, the next hinge point is the low back pelvis. So you want to give a little bit more. So this knee must always remain over the foot and impact. If we have enough depth and enough force as we land, we want to give a little bit more. And that's going to require the knees to move forward over the toe a little bit because it allows the center of mass to stay over our base of support, not increasing that resistance arm posteriorly so we influence the low back. Frequency. We really want to think about training frequency. And one of the things that you're going to encounter as you get into the exercise prescription class, you're going to learn something about the half-life of training. Well, the half-life of training tells us that when we apply a training bout to the body, there's kind of a little bit of a breadcrumb trail left within the body in terms of its resonance within the activity. So basically, you're creating a movement pattern, and the body is going to create a connectivity to that movement pattern, but also to the specific nature of that movement, how intense it was, what the range of motion was, all of those things. And in order for us to get the maximum development out of that, it has to occur within 96 hours of the preceding bout of exercise. So that gives you up to 4 days. So if we did this today, we would do squats today. As long as we repeat that between now and doing it Thursday, we're within that 96-hour window. If we do it Friday, we pass the 96-hour window. So what happens is, at Friday, we lose half of that transfer. Whatever that information was that we were going to transfer to that next activity, we lose half of it. So think about this. If you're that guy who does an exercise once a week, you're really not going to find the greatest amount of continual adaptation to a once a week bout of exercise. You know, my analogy I always use is think about this. We've all gotten in that position where you wake up late and you sprint to the bus. Do you develop a better, aerobic capacity for your anaerobic sprint capacity by doing it once? Or maybe you do it every couple of weeks because, you've got that long weekend with your friends or that bad work shift on Sunday night and you got Monday classes and you tend to oversleep, and it's always on that every 2 week span or every 4 week span that it happens. Well, that's not going to help you develop that. Then think about exercise order. We have a specific pattern of how we recruit exercises, and the muscle has a rest period between exercises. Weaker muscles are exercised last, but there's even more to this exercise order. You want to think about working, complex movements to simple movements, because the more complex a movement is, the higher its level of neural involvement is going to be. The coordination requirements are going to be much higher for doing something like an Olympic lift than they would be doing something like a bicep curl. So the higher the neural recruitment requirements are going to be, the higher the risk of injury. Especially if you're thinking about doing an overhead snatch versus doing something where we're just simply doing a shoulder press. Going to be a big difference in that stability protection factor. But we don't want to get to the point of doing that, last in the chain, because if it's fatigued out, something's going to go awry. The other thing we want to think about is working multi-joints to single joints. We don't want to fatigue things out of context. If we're thinking about taking things out as doing single joint exercises, most often single joint exercises are viewed as something that should be done for rehabilitative purposes. The majority of the time in your training programs, most of what you should be doing is multi-joint exercises. So in that position, the ability to do bicep curls is going to be something where it's a minor importance of the movement rather than the major importance of the movement. So it should come last. And then always think about large muscle groups to small muscle groups, because large muscle groups burn more fuel. They're going to require more energy. You don't want to do those last when you've got no energy left in the tank. So it pretty much comes down to common sense approach, but you'd be surprised how many people just don't connect up to that one. Maintenance. This is the use it or lose it philosophy. Once you develop a capacity in the body, it works best to maintain that. It may be maintained with less frequent sessions. It depends upon what your purpose for maintenance is. If you just want to maintain that at a very minimal threshold of status quo, less frequent sessions is going to be okay. But if you're talking about developing it and maintaining it for a performance aspect, usually we're going to find that the activities in a sports season are going to provide enough stress on that we can lower the frequency and still get that through alternate training stress. So practice is going to provide us equal stress that we would find for that. So we don't want to overload the body. Symmetry is essential. It's that balance between joint flexibility and strength. It's that finding that right joint geometry for where posture accommodates the best position for movement opportunity. Gravity, we know that maximum resistance works when we go against gravity, and it's going to be the minimum resistance when we're working with gravity. So if you're bringing a weight downward, you're going to control it differently than if you're moving a weight upward. Anthropometry just basically says that we're all designed to be different, so we aren't going to take even the same people who are same body type, same body size, you're not going to give them the same specific details. You're going to individualize that down to that person's particular specific needs because they're going to be the only reference point that you would use. Age, we want to think about using caution with kids. We want to think about how do we approach that prepubescent versus postpubescent opportunities with strength training, so that we're not doing unnecessary harm for that. But it's also to the point where with elderly people, what we get into with the elderly population is we often think about, it's called the China doll syndrome, where we all love grandma so much. We want to take care of doing everything for grandma because it's, oh, grandma, let me do that. Grandma, let me do that. It's the Boy Scouts helping the elderly lady across the street. We think about it, it's like, okay, grandma, it's great. We bring you out, we put you on display for family functions, we dust you off, but then when we're done, we put you back on that shelf because we want to keep you protected. We don't want you to do that. The problem is that it comes down to that user to lose it. If grandma doesn't maintain it, she's going to suffer, negative movement impacts because she's going to lose flexibility, she's going to lose muscular strength. All of this joint symmetry is going to start to erode. Risk factors. Biggest risk factors we want to avoid is avoid motion to the extreme limits of cervical or lumbar flexion and hyperextension. Especially involving lumbar and cervical flexion and hyperextension with rotation involved. So we don't want to get into a hyperextension movement or a flexion movement and then have rotation involved in the low back. So avoid those combinations of motions in the vertebral column. Avoid forcing the knee joint into extreme flexion or hyperextension. And the last one is a conditional thing. So it says never hold the breath while exercising. But one of the things we teach people to do is called the Valsalva maneuver. So you want to increase the intra-abdominal pressure to support spinal rigidity by taking a deep breath, holding it on the way down in a squat, and then releasing it on the way up. What they don't want you to do is hold your breath continually through the exercise. So this has to be qualified. We don't want you passing out because you're not breathing, and you basically see that person who's like going through the range of motion, and all of a sudden it's like they pass out after they've done that. Can't tell you how many times I've seen people, in a near maximal or maximal, exercise testing program where they don't breathe, they perform the rep, and then they stand up and they're lightheaded and almost pass out right afterward. So always think about exhale on the force output phase. So if you're pushing against resistance or lifting against resistance, breathe out. Breathe in when you're recovering that motion. So for squats, it would be breathing in on the way down, breathing out on the way up. Knowing the types of exercise, the concentric, eccentric, isometric, isotonic, isokinetic, and how to use those different types of contractions in an exercise program to produce the results you need. How do we create that so that we can control positions, fundamental positions, we can control positions at extreme ranges of motion. It's all in that, interplay between the concentric contraction of the agonists, the eccentric control of the antagonists, the isometric control of the stabilizers and fixators, and then, the isotonic control against the normal resistance, the isokinetic control, so we're controlling the speed of movement. Typically when we think about free weights, we think about concentric exercises. It's the resistance to the contraction is the product of the weight, the length of the resistance arm. Maximum resistance occurs when gravity is acting at right angles to the lever. So if we're moving against gravity, in a bench press, it's a prime example of how we achieve maximal resistance. Same thing we want to see when we do pulley exercises. It allows us to use the pulley to redirect the force of the gravity because gravity is pulling down on the stack, but the pulleys are redirecting that force to the right angles of the movement. You know, because if we're doing something where we're standing here doing a bench press motion, what's wrong with this? Doing bench press horizontal, it doesn't really have any resistance. You know, so you're not getting the full effect of that. Limitation is inability to impose maximum tension through range of motion. You know, so if we're coming to a point where we fail and fatigue, you know, it's going to, you know, really show the minimum or the extent of our maximum tension capacity. You know, and the repetition maximum is just that. It's the maximum force output that we can do this. And oftentimes we use this as a 1 rep max, but you'll see as you get through fitness development programs, you'll often see things used as like a 5 rep max or a 10 rep max. You know, so it's just how many you would do as a maximum number of repetitions, and then you can adjust accordingly to that. We do 1 repetition maximum because that gives us our maximum force output, and then it's really easy to go, oh, calculate 70% of 100 pounds versus going, well, I did 70 pounds 10 times, now what's my maximum? Now you got to go through the regression equation to say, okay, for every repetition you perform, it's 2.5% of your maximum. So if I did 10 repetitions, that's about 75% of my maximum. You know, so at that position, now I'm 12 repetitions at 70%, 10 repetitions at 75%. You know, I can then go, okay, well now, what's 80% of that calculated 1 rep max versus going, what's 80% of 100 pounds? So most often you'll see this as a 1 rep max because it's just easier to do. Why would we do a 10 rep max versus a 1 rep max? What's the advantage of doing a 10 rep max? Well, it's a certain economy of motion, but if you think about it in an untrained population, it's a little safer to do a lower percentage of maximum and do a repetition range maximum rather than a singular maximum. You know, so if you're teaching high school kids, probably better to do a 5 or a 10 rep max than a 1 rep max. Also, easier to do this if we're dealing with high school kids because at that position, we can calculate their 1 rep max, but we're not pushing them to that point where we suddenly have, you know, any concerns about, you know, doing maximal resistance training with, say, a 15 or 16-year-old who's just gone through puberty. You know, so we don't have any of those age complications that we're dealing with. So sometimes the range is to our advantage, you know, but the opposite is true too. If we never train with our maximal, you know, force output, when we get to the point of trying to recruit that in activity and we've never experienced that, then we're going to have a deficit in our performance. And that's where sometimes closing that deficit in our performance is essential to mitigating injury risk. So if you've got someone who's out there and they're doing a combative exercise and they're doing, you know, jiu-jitsu or judo or something like that, and they've never moved against that type of force, they don't know how to control that, and so their proprioceptors shut down, and it may be at the wrong point in time in that movement when their proprioceptors shut down, and all of a sudden you go from having resistance and all of a sudden your Golgi tendon organ kicks in and you got no force production. You know, not always the thing you want to do when you're in a combative situation or in the middle of an explosive movement activity like an Olympic lift. You don't want to suddenly find yourself in the midst of that resistance and have your proprioceptor say, okay, this reflex is going to take over, the tendon reflex is going to go on, and it's going to say, boom, we shut down. Versus coming in there and saying, the stretch reflex kicks in, and we're going to do explode through. So it really does have a lot to do with how we recruit that and how appropriate that development is. Eccentric exercise. A lot of times it's the return movement of concentric exercise, but sometimes it can be the initial aspect of the movement. So if we're thinking about a squat, eccentric is the initial phase of movement, going downward. We're resisting that influence of gravity. You know, so the eccentric contraction can sustain more tension and be more effective in strength development. The problem is it also creates more delayed onset muscle soreness. You know, so the greater level of eccentric control that we have, the greater overall tension we create in the muscle, the more potential degradation, microtrauma to the muscle that we can encounter. The other thing that we see about eccentric exercises is one of them, there's a lot of, theory out there about, negatives. When we do resistance training for negatives. One of the things is, part of it is that proprioceptive connection that if you can go and teach your body how to control that eccentric phase of the movement, that the body gets used to that force, gets used to that, tension that's within the muscle, and the Golgi tendon organ will adapt to that, and it will allow you to then produce that movement. So if you want to do a 1 rep maximum and you never experience that weight, sometimes, going not just to the limit of your 1 rep max, but actually do negatives where you're eccentrically contracting and all you're focusing on is the downward phase, it overrides the Golgi tendon organ to the point where when you do that 1 rep maximum with a new weight, the body says, oh, I can see where I've done this before, I can control this, and this is the highest stress point. So if I can override the highest stress point, I'm not going to kick in when I try to do the concentric phase of movement. So negatives, they're an advanced training method. You need to really be on your task with knowing how you're going to use those, why you're going to use those, and the appropriate methodology. Same thing for plyometric exercises. Part of the plyometric exercises is to create that eccentric contraction, but it's an abrupt version of an eccentric contraction, followed by an explosive concentric contraction. So taking advantage of the stretch reflex, and these again are very specific conditions. It's an advanced form of training. You wouldn't really recommend doing plyometric exercises with that initial phase of novice people who are your training. It doesn't have the efficacy or the safety that's necessary to develop. Isometric exercises. We do a lot of isometric exercises in different types of fitness activities without really even thinking about it. A lot of our yoga, isometric exercises, but we also do the isometric exercises every time we're trying to control the position to control range of motion. So everything that's going on in being able to sit or stand in a squat movement that's not involved in the actual up and down movement, but the rotation or the lateral sway is all involving isometric control. And so it's appropriate for us to be able to utilize that and know that we can recruit that effectively, so that we can control actual joint angle, where the contraction occurred, how do we control that, Isometric, oftentimes we see is rehabilitation because it's providing us the opportunity to recruit the muscles under a maximum force output, minimal motion aspect to provide muscle strength. So if we're looking at providing range of motion due to an injury, the first thing we want to do is to provide that protection of the joint stability before we start going through joint mobility. Isotonic simply means constant tension. And we saw the isotonic example in using the barbell. But the problem is it's limited in its ability because as we change the range of motion, the internal movement arm changes. The attachment point of the muscle in the bicep changes the length of the moment arm as you go through elbow flexion from 0 to 130 degrees. It's going to change the moment arm. As the moment arm length changes, it's going to have differential mechanical advantage. Where the moment arm is the shortest, you're going to have the best advantage to moving the muscle. Where it's the longest, you're going to have the least. So we can use isotonic to our advantage, but we have to understand that typically isotonic uses constant tension. A better representation of constant tension would be using something like an elastic band, rather than just simply focusing on that barbell or dumbbell. Nautilus came in, and yes, this picture is that old. This was late 60s, early 70s when the Nautilus company introduced their first cam. And what they do is change the resistance moment arm. So the pivot point stays fixed, but the movement cam changes an adjustment. Unlike this position where we look over here at this pulley, all these pulleys are the same size throughout the range of motion. But if you go to a knotless piece, they look like a clamshell or a, one of those little, shells that you put up to your ear at the beach where they expand from the center point outward, so they get farther and farther away from the moving axis of rotation, lengthening the resistance arm, and that length of the resistance arm change is designed to correlate to the changing internal movement arm of our joints, so that as we move through the range of motion, it's going to get harder at the time when our internal mechanical advantage is at its greatest. The dungeon-esque pieces. The good old Cybex, isokinetic devices, these things are torture. So you exercise at a constant speed. And yes, the grimace on her face is not in, jests, because literally this movement arm, the harder you push against it, the harder it resists against you. It is the most evil intent designed that you can think of. Because as you're trying to force this lever up, all it's doing is saying, okay, the preset speed says 180 degrees per second. So it stops anything going beyond that by going harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. So it's like, okay, if you think about this, it's like trying to drive 10 miles an hour. So the faster you put on your accelerator, the harder you push on your brake. It's resisting it internally. And it's really exhaustive, because even at the maximum, most of these machines are set, used to be the ones we had here years ago when we had a biomechanics lab, was set at a maximum speed of 360 degrees per second. Well, that's extremely slow. Much of our movement speed that we do for general activities is somewhere between 1100 to 2000 degrees per second. So you're talking about restricting it at 1/3 of, if we're trying to do an explosive upward maximal vertical jump, and our angular velocity of our joints involved in that upward thrust is 1100 degrees per second, we're talking about trying to move through maximal force output at 1/3 the rate of movement speed. So that's like, as you try to push harder, somebody's loading more weights on the bar as you're trying to make that ascent phase in the movement. So if you can imagine, having your friend sitting in the leg extension machine here on the 3rd floor, and the harder you push, the harder they're pushing back against you to resist that movement. That's where you're going to find yourself, in that battle between what is that accommodating resistance. So modifications, when we modify common exercises to fit the progressive resistant concept, how do we do that? Typically, we increase or change the length of the resistance arm, as we did with, the overhead squat. We can also increase the magnitude of the resistance. This is the primary way we increase our progressive resistances to do that. So an example of the influence of the range of motion of the moment arm, we can change the position here. If we're doing, the position where we're doing a abdominal crunch, we can change the position of the torso. As we do that, the resistance arm changes its length, but also we can change and adjust the position of the arms. So instead of being arms overhead behind the head, we can do arms crossed over the chest, arms down to the side, changing the effective loading point of the center of mass of that body in movement. So here we see how we can change that by changing arms to the side, arms crossed over, arms behind the head. Longest resistance arm is here, shortest resistance arm is here. We can do the same thing by applying an external resistance. We could do increasing the mass of the dumbbell, doing that, weighted abdominal curl. So when we select abdominal exercises, one of the things we want to think about is, they must be able to prevent the tilting of the pelvis. So if they can't isolate and stabilize the tilting of the pelvis and hyperextension of the lumbar spine, we have to adjust the length of the lever arm or the mass of the body segments in movement, to provide them the position where they can perform that. Because if they can't control this, they're putting the low back region at more of a vulnerable state. We want to think about strengthening all the abdominal muscles, not just the rectus abdominis. This isn't just developing the six-pack muscles. We want to think about developing the obliques, internal, external. We want to think about transverse abdominis. The transverse abdominis is really the keystone of everything we do in recruiting the abdominal structure, because it's the one that really ties together the anterior aspect of the abdominal wall to the posterior element of the low back, and also involves the upper region of the diaphragm. Back bends which stretch the abdominals are not desirable for strengthening. We don't want to do too much hyperextension of the lumbar spine. Push-up, we can do a progressive resistance series where it's hands and knees, one push-up, hands and knees, hip extended, half push-up, same as number 2, full push-up, push-up position, feet on the floor, hands on the fourth or fifth step. So we can do, incline push-ups, we can do decline push-ups, we can do 2 feet on the ground, 1 foot on the ground. We can do stable positions where we're feet on a flat level surface, or we can do unstable positions. We can do one-arm push-ups. So seen in this position here where, we decrease the length of the resistance arm, lengthening the resistance arm, and then we could change that all the way through doing that decline push-up as well. Same thing we can do with the resistance series of pull-up. It's bent arm, hand, chin above bar, reverse the pull-up, slowly letting down from the bent arm hang. So this is kind of in our version of a pull-up doing the negatives. So going from the reverse hang position, that flexed arm hang, to the full extension. Modified pull-up from a low bar with a body in a semi-supine position, hanging position. This is what we see in some of the TRX stuff that we're doing now. Arms straight, heels on the floor, pulling up the body, standing on a bench inclined enough to permit the subject to grasp a bar with elbows partially flexed. We could see, progression all the way up to pull-ups with weights attached to a vest or to a weight, the waist. So always when we get to the point of evaluating exercises, this is the fallback. What is the purpose of this exercise? Why are we doing it? And how effectively does this exercise accomplish its purpose? Does it in any way violate the principles of good mechanics or good, anatomy? And, what are the chief joint and muscular actions involved in it? And then think about, what is our beginning intensity? What is the difficulty of the activity? Is it designed to do strength, endurance, power? Are there any elements of danger, injury, or strain which precautions should be taken? So are there specific areas or aspects to which we would teach or reteach the technique aspect of the movement? It is likely to call forth any undesirable, harmful responses against which the performer should be on guard. Again, this is the kind of momentum thing we don't want to have. Is momentum desired or is momentum not desired? And if the exercise is a difficult one, what preliminary exercises would serve to prepare the performer for that activity? All right, questions? We will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to go through a lot of the different, videos, things like that. We will actually then go over Wednesday. I'm hoping to get